Okay, we've got recording. So Dawn was until recently a professor at Keele University, but has moved across to the East Midlands. She's now at Nottingham-Trent University to the position of Executive Dean. I'm going to have to read this. Executive Dean of the School of Animal, Rural and Environmental Sciences. Do add questions to the chat. And Professor Jo Prothero and I are going to ask those questions from you at the end of Dawn's talk. So thank you very much, Dawn. Over to you.
Thank you. I am just slightly struggling with IT today, as many of us always do. So let me just hopefully be able to hopefully share my screen. It's nice when it all works smoothly, but it's not working smoothly today, I'm afraid, for me. So,
if you're really struggling, Dawn, you could send your presentation to Sue Stewart and
yeah, yes, I'm just trying to get the right thing on to be able to share. I really do apologize.
It's coming now.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I just check you can see that?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so get started because I know you're on a tight time frame. Okay, so thank you for inviting me today. And I did think it was a bit strange to be invited to the conference, but Christian said we really would like there, and it would be really nice to hear sort of wildlife, your perceptions of wildlife and how it helps sort of people and the health benefits. So I'll just give you a bit of an overview to what I do in terms of research and my background and how I've started to get interested in that human-wildlife interaction dynamics and how I think we need to think about humans and wildlife and the environment in a bigger context, which fits into what Christian was saying about sustainability. But I think there's a lot of benefits we can get from, and I'm hopefully be able to demonstrate that to you today. So my research is usually based on animals, and it's also based on carnivores. So I do a lot of work with carnivores in terms of understanding their populations, their behavior, their movements. And one of the things that I might be most famous for is my work with foxes, urban foxes in the UK. So this is quite an interesting sort of area of concern because obviously they're living alongside humans. Their population seems to be doing well in urban environments, and people and foxes are adapting to live together. So there's a really interesting human-wildlife dynamic there. And if you talk to people about sort of foxes, you get a very polarized view. Some people think there is a potential disease risk or a threat risk. And there's also people that actually get a lot of benefit out of having that interaction with wildlife and build very close social bonds. And we know that social bonds with animals are integral to us as humans, and they've been a long time in terms of human evolution. So it's a really interesting dynamic when we start to look at a carnivore living alongside humans, especially in this country, which I'll try to focus on. I don't just work on carnivores, I work on lots of other species as well in the UK. So hedgehogs, obviously firm favourite with the public, water voles, badgers, and I work with different organisations. So I predominantly work with conservation organisations, looking at how we can conserve populations, but also how we can sort of come up with some solutions to try and help them in terms of boost them. But we also look at the threats and the declines and reasons for those declines. And we work very closely with people like the RSPCA, the Wildlife Trusts and other RSPB to try to find sort of solutions to help animals. So it's very much about a health population trying to conserve. So that's where I've sort of come from in terms of trying to focus on the animals. But I'll explain why I'm interested in primary care as well. I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to work with the media on some of the topics, and I think it's because the public has quite a strong interest in wildlife. And there's a lot more interaction. So we've seen an increase in people feeding birds in gardens. Around about 90% of people across the country now provide some form of food in their garden for birds. So this is sort of like a growing trend in the UK, but in other places as well, where that connectivity with wildlife and that interest in wildlife is growing again, which is fantastic. As I think there's been quite a disconnect with an increase in urban areas, people living in urban areas, that disconnect with nature has been quite acute and quite, I think, detrimental to us as humans in terms of well-being. So I've managed to work with media on multiple different things in terms of trying to help people understand, get to know different species. And that's actually given me a link to the general public and to start those conversations and dialogues around what people feel, what people think, how they interact. So one of the issues that sort of came up, and this goes back to foxes, was the concern about foxes in urban areas. And this was a few years ago, about some of the health risks and also some of the sort of threat risks. So there was lots of things in the media about potential risks from foxes. And I was really interested, if the audience, if you think about a fox, do you see it as something positive or something negative? Do you see it as a risk to your health or a benefit to your health? I think you would get different views. So as part of this sort of interest in fox populations, changes in foxes, we started doing some research with a media company to do a big broadcast to try to get public engagement in looking at foxes. So we worked with Channel 4. It was about 3 one-hour programs. We were talking all about fox history and ecology. But what we also did with this is a platform of a website for people to be able to engage, submit their records. So if they'd seen a fox, they could take a photo, they could tell us where it was so that we could look at where they were. And also to do a questionnaire. So we did a questionnaire of what they felt, what their concerns, what were their worries, what were the potential incidents as well. And we also had lots of other fun things on that website that you could see where the foxes were going, what the behavior was. So it was a really multi sort of platform program that was really engaging the public in this potential sort of issue and trying to get some data from the general public. So this is called Citizen Science, where we use citizens and publics to help with scientific research. And it's things that I do quite frequently. So I rely on volunteers, I rely on the public, and that means I have to get to understand them as well, what their drivers are, what their interests are. So just to show you some of the data that came from that. So one of the data on the left-hand side is the map. So this was where we got records from people. So in a 3-week period, we got 17,000 records of foxes across the whole country. Now that's a huge amount of people interested, taking photos, engaging with wildlife, and then sending us their records. So we managed to go get national distribution maps of urban foxes for across the country using the general public. Because those photos were submitted, we actually managed to also look at a disease in foxes, which is mange. And it is a concern for some people in terms of mange with regards to the welfare of the animals, but also potential transmission to dogs. So we wanted to know, what the occurrence of that mange was and whether we could map this. So this is an image of a fox with quite progressive mange. So you can see the sort of hyperkeratosis in there and some alopecia. So, it's quite a progressed disease and it's not particularly nice, but by using the general public, we could get epidemiological data on a disease of wildlife. We also use the general public to work out density. So we asked them questions about had they seen fox cubs in their garden, and this helped us work out how many family groups were in an area. But tagged onto this questionnaire, we also asked them who they were, basically from if they lived on their own, their age, whether they fed animals, how they fed animals, and how they thought about different animals as well. And it was very clear from that data that we were looking at that, there seemed to be some patterns here about the people that were feeding and engaging with wildlife, and those that were getting a lot of benefits back from them. So we discovered really that there was a two-way interaction between people and animals in urban areas. So a lot of people were feeding, not just birds, but in some cases foxes. So we had here questionnaires, what do they feed? And then how many people feed? So you can probably see for this, if you were given a dog this type of diet, it probably wouldn't be very healthy for it. There's a lot of carbohydrates, there's a lot of fats, and it tends to be left over. So it's not very natural diet. And we do actually find quite obese fat foxes in urban areas. And we were discovering that a lot of people were feeding foxes and sometimes feeding them by hand. So there was a concern there potentially about, risk and threats. But what this showed us is there's a lot of people engaging with wildlife. Nearly 75% of people who fed wildlife, who were feeding these animals, were feeding them every single day. So there was a very strong social connected bond, and they were providing their own resources to support these animals. So this leads us on to, you know, some of the questionnaire data we got back when we were asking people about what were the sort of benefits and costs of living with wildlife. And we discovered around about 90% of people who lived in cities said they liked foxes, and 81% said that seeing foxes in cities actually enriches their lives. So there's definitely some positive benefits there. From an ecological point of view, we know foxes are important in ecosystem services and health. And some things I kept mentioning was about health benefits, the health benefits of seeing animals. And I used to say this without actually trying to understand fully what that meant to people. What are the health benefits? Because there's also some risks. You know, there are some diseases that can be passed between humans and wildlife, such as toxo. There are some potential diseases to pets, and there is a potential risk as well there because they are wild animals. But I think the perception risk, which is in the percentages here, is higher than the actual risk. So these percentages are what people are saying they're worried about, not necessarily exactly what's happened. So I'm going to stop talking about foxes now. I think I might come back to them a little bit, but I'm going to talk about health benefits. So this is something that led me into health benefits. So those of you that are sort of aware of what's happening in terms of looking at environment and health, and I think many of you who work in a primary care understand that lifestyle interaction with the environment really does define and can help in terms of health. And there is a sort of One Health agenda now. So there's more people on the planet and they're living in closer proximity to animals and to each other. There's changes in habitats, so changing climates, changing land use, and these are causing more sort of conflict and more pressures. We travel more and we use animals not just as food, but obviously domestic animals and farming animals as well. So there's lots of different factors here that could increase potential disease transmission or risk between these animals, but both ways, a risk to animals, conservation and biodiversity, as well as a risk to human health. So this One Health approach tackles, you know, those shared health agendas between the environment and people and animals. So if we think about what types of topics fall into sort of One Health, they include zoonotic disease, antibiotic resistance, antimicrobial resistance is obviously a large concern. And there have been an incident on a beach where there was a seal with a highly resistant bacteria strain, which, you know, if it got into the environment, that could be a really big concern for us. And I think it's possibly come from a sewage outlet. So you can see these dynamics of, you know, if it happens, there are some really big risks there. Food security and safety, we've got vector-borne diseases. So I've put some things on the side that you may be aware of that, you know, you may have come across or some discussions around. So in terms of zoonotic diseases, we're talking sort of like viral diseases. You've got Lyme disease as well. And then, you know, I think the big, talk about the C word in this case, I know the C word has changed, but COVID. So where has COVID come from? We think it's come from wildlife and that interaction between humans. And so we do need to consider human-wildlife dynamics and how it affects us. So you might think, how does my research fit at all with healthcare? So I just wanted to put this example in there because I've talked a lot about foxes. So one of the diseases in terms of One Health is Echinococcus, and the main host for that is carnivores, so including the red foxes. So in the UK, AHPAVA monitor, so the Animal Veterinary Health Monitoring Service, monitor Echinococcus in fox feces to see if it occurs. Now, it's not a big issue in this country. It's seen as we're being free from it, but there is a growing incidence in Europe, and we are at risk of potentially this new, you know, disease coming, this new parasite coming here. So I think, you know, we have to do that wildlife surveillance. We have to do that surveillance of emerging diseases. So they might not be here yet. They may come in future, and understanding the fox population is going to be incredibly key to understanding how we control that and mitigate against that potential emerging disease. So I'm going to go on to human-wildlife interactions in health now. So when we talk about human-wildlife interactions, there's lots of different sort of typologies. So it can be, you immediately next to wildlife, really engaged, or it can be just walking through a park. It can be passive, it can be active. You can have negative and positive interactions as well. So there's a whole typology around human-wildlife interactions, which I'm not going to go into, but just to set the context, it's not necessarily about a direct contact. It could be indirect, less immediate, and it can go both ways. So I wanted to go through the health benefits of wildlife, and in this context we're talking about wildlife and nature interactions, and it's very difficult to distinguish between the two because obviously wildlife is part of nature, and if you've got nature, hopefully you've got wildlife as well. And when we define health, I'm defining it in 3 ways: so physical, social and mental well-being. So in terms of physical health, what evidence is there that wildlife, nature has physical benefits? So there's been a few different studies done, and I think historically, we've got this term that, nature is a really good remedy. And I'm sure some of you practice that, to be able to engage in nature. It's not just the walking, but actually engaging can be really positive. So there was a study done looking at, experience of people in hospitals and with their views, and a window view of a nature experience, so something that's more green, can actually lower the levels of pain experienced by patients, but also reduce recovery times, which is what we all want. Being exposed to natural daylight can help regular diurnal rhythms, and that can help with neurological conditions as well. So we are circadian, we're diurnal, we have circadian rhythms, and we need to have those circadian rhythms in terms of well-being. Access to nature can also reduce blood pressure, reduce stress, and also reduce obesity in relation to people who have that access to nature tend to be more active as well. I've put in interactions with animals because there's quite a lot of work on pet therapy and pet interactions, but people with pets, so that connection with an animal can lower blood pressure, plasma cholesterol and triglyceride values. They tend to engage in more physical activity, and actually overall people who own pets tend to have reduced factors of cardiac disease. So, we know these benefits of linking animals with nature and people and how that can physically benefit. I think the other thing is about stress. So if we talk about physical, obviously stress, I'm sure many of you know that stress can stop recovery, it can reduce recovery, and it can accelerate certain diseases. So one of my colleagues works very closely with cancer, and we've had multiple discussions about, how we could potentially use nature and nature interaction to reduce stress in cancer patients. And that is some things that are done, because when there's been treatments on mice, the tumours tend to grow faster in more stressed animals, and things like social isolation can cause more stress as well. So psychological stress, isolation can increase cancer tumour growth rates. It can reduce the chance of relapse, and when stress is reduced. So patients are less likely to go into relapse if they are less stressed. So we know there's a really good link between recovery, disease progression, if we can reduce stress, and stress we can reduce through engagement with nature. So the other thing is social health. So there's 3. So first one was physical, second one was social. So social isolation can lead to lower well-being, longer recovery periods, and reduced survival. So, I think this has been an agenda in the last couple of years, understanding that social isolation, especially in older people, can really impact their dependency on the NHS as well. So interactions with nature can actually reduce those feelings of isolation and increase feelings of connectivity, not just with people, but also with their environment. Access to green spaces can also help with communities, so promoting social cohesion, doing group-based activities, developing social ties, and increase individuals' well-being. That seems quite conceptual, but actually I'm going to give you examples. So I work with people on a hedgehog project down in Brighton, and most of the people, there's around about 120 volunteers, and they are all older people mainly, and they form a group, and that whole group is looking at how they support hedgehogs in their community. They meet regularly, they share ideas, they go around to each of the places and make hedgehog holes, and they were part of this big monitoring project. So, you know, it was a really big social group, and a lot of them got a hell of a lot of benefit out of working in that community. We also know from studies that, you know, children's activities in green space actually improve social development as well. So I'm not just talking about older people in social isolation. We also know in the young generation, access to green space is incredibly important for development, health, connectivity. So I've got a little exercise now, quick exercise. So if you have a look at these two areas, in which sort of space would you feel less stressed? So hopefully you can do that straight away. And I'm hoping that most of you would choose in the left-hand picture. And that's because it's been shown that, you know, a better biodiversity is actually better for health. So it's not just about green space, it's about what that green space is. And more enriched green space for wildlife is a better space, and it has greater psychological benefits if we can enrich or enhance. So it's beneficial for both biodiversity and people, help both. I think most people, a lot of organizations now, some of the well-being organizations, the mental health organizations are understanding the benefits of wildlife and nature. And this is paired with those organizations that really, you know, want people to come and support them and offer those types of services. So for example, Mind, the Mental Health Foundation all have documentation on the benefits of nature on mental health. And a couple of years ago, some of you may have seen this about the Natural Health Service, about wildlife volunteers boosting mental health. So 95% of volunteers with low mental health had mental health improvements within 6 weeks of volunteering. So it can be quite immediate, the benefits, and it can actually ease the burden on the NHS because those people are feeling connected, supported, healthier outside, more positive, and have those community networks and supports. So lots of different organisations now supporting the well-being benefits of natural environments and wildlife. Another study that I've picked up, and also an area that I'm interested in because I have 2 teenage boys, is about mental health of teenagers and adolescents. Now, 1 in 6 people are between 10 and 19 years old, and around about mental health conditions account for about 16% of disease and injury in that group. So it's a very high proportion. So of our young people, mental health is becoming a growing, increasing issue. And it can lead to depression, and there are higher increased rates of suicide as well. So we need to try to find out how we can help support the mental health of our adolescents and teenagers. There's two papers what I thought would be quite interesting. One was a review of all the different mental health associated with children and teenagers. And of 35 papers, they found that around about 50% of those papers showed there was a positive relationship between nature and positive mental health outcomes. More recently, with COVID, this has been really interesting in terms of, I think it's very acutely, we've known the impacts of social isolation and lack of connectedness on our own mental health. And we are concerned about, you know, what the children and the teenagers have currently been through because mental health issues are growing. So there was a study done by Jackson very recently, so it was published this year in the USA, and they asked 624 adolescents about their experience pre and post lockdown in terms of engagement with mental health. And actually they found the impacts on mental health were greater after the pandemic. So before the pandemic, there was a slow increase, but after the pandemic, there was a greater increase of connectivity with nature. So maybe this is our urgent call now to try and help this issue, is to get opportunities for young people to get out there and get reconnected. So this leads me on to sort of my last study. And this is something that I'm interested in. So it's about the wildlife benefits during COVID. So we've had quite a difficult 18 months, if not longer. And, you know, that isolation and disconnectedness has been quite severe on many people's mental health. People ask me what wildlife did during lockdown, and you can see from this picture what they did is they exploited the cities and the spaces that people weren't. So that lack of disturbance, wildlife adapted to lockdown as well. I'm going to focus on humans. So this study was done by Emily Shoesmith quite recently. So I think she was published this year. And she was looking at the impacts of companion, non-companion animal interactions with people during lockdown. And there was about 6,000 people. And I've put here what her non-companion animal interactions were. So it was feeding birds, watching wildlife, visiting sanctuaries, helping reserves, those types of things. So all those types of things that, nature reserves, a connection with wildlife. What Emily found is that interactions with wildlife during lockdown had positive impacts on mental health. Participants reported sense of awe and privilege of seeing these animals, which again was very positive mental health. Seeing the animals in their environment provided opportunities for distraction, and reduce feelings of distress during the pandemic. So it actually supported reducing that stress. So that's mental and physical benefits. They provided reduced feelings of loneliness and social isolation. So there was companionship in that interaction, again, social benefits, sense of familiarity with the birds. So they started to become knowing and familiar and connected. And they also engaged in a lot more animal-focused activity and created new networks and links and created connectivity with people who were also interested. And they also went and visited those sites more, so more physical engagement because they'd seen animals, they'd seen wildlife, they went there more often. So it was a very brief talk, but just in summary, interactions with wildlife can have positive impacts on physical, social, and mental health. It can reduce social isolation and increase connectedness. It can reduce stress, which can benefit recovery, and also reduce chances of relapse in some diseases. It can improve well-being. It develops links with communities and supports communities, and also increasing physical activity as well. So that is me, and I will take any questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Dawn. Really, really enlightening. So there's a question from Joe Prothero. Is there any evidence of improved mental health in children and adolescents with interactions with wildlife and pets?
Yeah, there's evidence. I think the problem with most of the scientific studies is it's quite complex. So, you can't take out a single element and say we're going to change this, because mental health, there's lots of different issues. And I think that's why when you review the studies, you're only getting sort of 50% of the studies saying there's significance. The other studies don't quite show the significance because there's lots of different compounding factors in mental health. But there's lots of evidence about children's benefits in terms of mental health with regards to connectivity with nature. So I think there's more positive research. So there's more research that supports there's a positive connection. And I also think that it feels very natural connection, and it's something that's accessible. So, what are the alternatives? You're talking about mental health treatment with drugs, or, that seems quite intervention and very sort of short term. Whereas if we can do something long term where we actually build that connectedness, we build that passion, we build those links, that's a longer term sustainable resolution to mental health. It's not just giving them drugs, it's about actually looking at how do you get that feeling of self-reflection and self and where you are. So there's lots of evidence, but it's sometimes not.
It's complex.
It's complex. And that's why some of the studies don't always show it, because there's other confounding factors in that scientific design.
So there's another question from Glenn. Is there any evidence that earlier exposure to nature in childhood is associated with an enhanced therapeutic effect or improvement in mental health in adulthood?
I don't think those types of long-term studies have been done where there's been an exposure very early on and then seeing whether that treatment affects. However, when studies have been done on older people about reconnecting them to nature, one of the things that has been discovered is the narrative that comes out when you talk to those people about why. And why they are getting those benefits is because of their childhood. So they've come from a childhood where they've been very connected with nature. So maybe farming background, agricultural backgrounds, or backgrounds where they went out into the fields as a kid and ran around, and actually you see what they're saying of why they are feeling better relates back to their early childhood experiences with their connectivity. Does that make sense? So although there's not the longitudinal study, the narrative of what's happened and why suggests there is a fundamental link back to childhood experience, that positive childhood experience in the first place.
Thanks. And that makes sense, doesn't it, when you consider adverse childhood experiences having negative effects. So a question from Faraz: what do you think is the role of primary care in engaging with urban animals like foxes and badgers, as we do more in terms of green spaces? So in the chat, lots of comments about practices having an allotment, or working with social prescribing services to develop the area around the practice. But what about animals?
So as I said, I think animals are a key part, and I think there was a mention about awe and inspiration. And I think, lots of people connect very closely with mammals because we are mammals ourselves. So there's an affinity association. So I think that type of connectedness can go through experience and links with animals, not just the nature itself. I think people have got an accessibility in an urban environment. Nearly 90% of the population lives in an urban or suburban environment. That's most what people will be connected to with nature. And there is quite a lot of social injustice in terms of access to green space. Those urban green spaces and urban gardens are incredibly important, and to enrich them with wildlife and have a fox come through, for me, that's amazing. And for kids to see that and be inspired by that is really, really good. In terms of links with primary care, so I started to look at this natural health service, and there's lots of different counties that are now providing a natural health service. So there's more prescriptions about interaction with nature, getting involved with groups, local groups. And quite a lot of the wildlife trusts are running things which are specifically for NHS referrals into connectivity. So I think it's only just started, but I think it will grow, because just the amazing benefit. It's not going to solve everything. It doesn't solve everything. But if we can have even a small impact on people's mental well-being, that's going to have a significant impact on the number of people coming in to the NHS for that type of, the time to deal with those complex cases, but also the pharmaceutical side. I think if we can avoid that, and I know most people do want to avoid that.
So just a question really from me and Jo. I feed the birds in my garden. Should we be feeding? What should we be using? Should we be feeding foxes, which again I do, but it's got rid of the hedgehogs. So I don't want to do things wrong.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question, because there has recently been a publication out that says that if you feed the birds, it creates a shift in the community. So some species do well, some species do less. But if we stop some of the population booms in some of the passerine species, is because people have been feeding them. So I think there needs to be more research about what we feed, how we feed. And that's exactly the same with foxes. If you feed a fox too much, or if you feed it by hand, that's not really beneficial to the animal or to you. But if you can feed in a way that you can see the animal and it benefits a little bit. So I tend to feed my fox maybe an egg every week. So it's getting a little bit and I get to see it. And that benefits me and it benefits the fox, but it's not that reliance on that. And it doesn't then create pockets of potential disease transmission. It doesn't create competition between animals. So we're working on that at the moment in terms of what should you feed, how should you feed, when should you feed to benefit. But anything that connects people with nature, I would say, yes, feed, but just be careful how you feed. Don't feed too much, feed natural food items, and don't build up a reliance where that animal's behaviour is shifted too much.
And that's just drawn me to a comment by Claire Jinks, jam sandwiches. I don't know if you feed your fox jam sandwiches, Claire.
So please don't feed foxes jam sandwiches. So no, foxes do naturally eat strawberries, but jam has obviously got very, very high sugar content. And also then the carbohydrate, they're not as good at digesting that. So that's a very processed food item. So foxes, if you want to feed them, so what do we feed foxes? I would just scatter out some very raw bits, little bits of raw protein. That's most aligned to their natural diet. So if you do have some spare meat, that's better. But they are omnivorous. They will take sort of fruits as well. But sandwiches are, you know, the bread, the carbohydrate, biscuits. I've had people feed them pizzas and vol au vents, and you know, you wonder why you see fat foxes. And in North America, the coyotes have got low immunity and heart disease because they're just fed too much. So yeah, they're mammals. Whatever you feed them, if you were fed that, you know, that's the consequences in terms of health.
Thanks very much. Well, we're running slightly late, so I'm going to have to stop. But can everybody put the cameras on and say thank you very much to Dawn? That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Bye.
Thank you so much.